Welcome back to our series of lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. This will be lecture number 31, the third in our series of lectures on the heirs of the Roman Empire. This time we're going to talk about the barbarian kingdoms. In other words, the heirs of the Western Roman Empire. Last time, you'll recall we talked about the Byzantine Empire, the emergence of the Byzantine Empire, the heirs of the Eastern Roman Empire, and then we also talked in the lecture before that about the Islamic world and the Arab peoples, perhaps, as I suggested, the most unpredictable of the three developments that succeeded to the Roman world. Now, in this particular lecture, we're going to start with a little housekeeping. That is to say, when we were talking about late antiquity, we had some kingdoms in place, so we're going to sort of sweep them aside and say a word or two about what happened to those earliest Germanic kingdoms. Then we're going to put some new kingdoms in place, particularly the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons, and we'll look at them in a little bit more detail. Why were they successful? And what were the consequences of their success? Then we're going to look at a very important historical phenomenon in Western Europe, namely the Christianization of Europe, the winning of much of the land of Western Europe for the Roman Catholic Church. And finally, we'll talk a little about the beginnings of the elaboration of a cultural pattern in the West made up of Roman, or at any rate classical elements, made up of Christian elements, and made up to a degree of Germanic elements as well. So this then is the job that we have before us. And we're going to notice evolution, we're going to notice change, but we're going to see these changes unfold, seems to me, in fairly consistent ways, just as we noticed, for example, with the Byzantine and with the Islamic world. When we come to the end of this lecture, the end of our consideration of these three heirs of the Roman Empire, I think we'll notice some quite remarkable similarities between and among these three regions. First of all, then, a little bit of house cleaning. The earliest Mediterranean-centered kingdoms, the earliest kingdoms to emerge on Roman soil, failed. Why? The Vandal kingdom, for example, in North Africa, had several strikes against it. The Vandals were militant Arians. You may recall we had mentioned that many of the Germanic peoples were converted to Arian Christianity either when they were living just along the frontiers of the Roman Empire or when they actually entered the Roman Empire. There were brief periods of time when leading members of the imperial family were themselves Arian, and therefore sometimes, and ironically, and tragically, and disastrously, various peoples entered the Roman Empire, embraced the form of Christianity then being practiced by the imperial family, in other words, what was then official, only to have the imperial family and the church turn to a new form of Christianity, leaving them hanging as heretics. But anyway, the Vandals were fanatical Arians. They were tyrannical pirates in the Western Mediterranean. I mean, basically, they lived by piracy. They took over much of the rich agricultural land of the North African coast and exploited that for their benefits, yes, but also they carried on piracy in the Western Mediterranean. They evoked sufficient howls of protest that Justinian launched armies against them, and between 532 and 534, he defeated them utterly, and basically they vanished from history, leaving only their name in Andalusia in Spain, which they passed through on their way to Africa. The Ostrogoths were also Arians. Now, they had been sent to Italy when Odoacer, for example, sent in 476 the imperial insignia back to Constantinople. This was a bit of a blow to the Romans. There was something about the historically rich and evocative land of Italy. To have parceled out Gaul, to have parceled out Spain, perhaps even to have begun losing the British Isles to various Germanic peoples, well, that wasn't necessarily something that would have been tops on the Roman agenda, but they were willing to deal with it. They accommodated themselves to it. But giving away Italy, that was different. So to maintain the sense that they were in control, the Romans actually sent, by Romans, of course, I mean the government at Constantinople, sent Theodoric, who reigned from 493 until 526, an Ostrogoth and his people into Italy to sort of wrest it back from Odoacer and then to rule it under the guise, under the guidance, under the leadership of the government at Constantinople. Now, Theodoric himself was an enormously gifted ruler. He carried on wide-ranging diplomatic relations in Western Europe with other Germanic kings. He managed to attain a considerable degree of peace and order in Italy. As far as we can tell, Italy was quite prosperous, really, during his reign. He didn't carry on sort of wars against the local Italian population. But Theodoric had, again, some strikes against him. He and his people were Arians. Now, this was particularly difficult to be in Italy, where obviously the Pope was, and to be representing the emperors. Now, the emperors in the East, as we've had occasion to see, may have tried from time to find a formula to reconcile Monophysites, but by this time the emperors were having nothing to do with Arianism, so this was dangerous for Theodoric. And then towards the last years of Theodoric's life, towards the last years of his reign, Italy was marked by a series of plots and schemes and seditions and treasons, and eventually the Emperor Justinian, after Theodoric died, sent his armies to Italy, and they waged 20 years of war there from 535 until 555. Brutal wars, devastating wars for Italy. Italy was won back nominally by the East Roman Empire, but was devastated in the process. Anyway, there go the Ostrogoths. For the Visigoths, the legacy of their defeat by the Franks in 507 at Vouillé, when they were driven over the Pyrenees, we mentioned that, you may just remember, in an earlier lecture on late antiquity, and then their attack along at least the Mediterranean coast by Justinian in the middle of the 6th century, their Arianism, they again were Arians, although they converted to Catholicism in the year 589 as a result of decisions made by a king and a church council, and their political disunity. So they're attacked, they're beaten by the Franks, they're attacked by the Romans, they are Arians, and they are politically disunited. In spite of all that, they persisted until 711, when finally Iberia was overrun by Berber tribesmen led by Arab commanders who entered in the great expansion of the Islamic Caliphate early in the 8th century. Now, the Visigothic state was, for all of that, one of considerable cultural achievements and considerable artistic achievements. It produced a number of writers and thinkers of some note. It was not devoid of interest. It was not devoid of success. But they never managed to overcome political disunity on the one hand and more powerful neighbors on the other, absent the Visigoths. The Lombards entered Italy in the winter of 568-69 in the wake of the Ostrogothic defeat. Now, there had actually been Lombard troops in the East Roman army that had fought against the Ostrogoths. And as a result, some of them may, in a way, have kind of scouted out the area and thought, well, this is a place that we can eventually take advantage of. And sure enough, they came in 568-9. The Byzantines never really accepted them. They couldn't do much about them, but they always regarded them as usurpers. They always regarded their position in Italy as irregular. The Lombards had some other strikes against them, however. They, like so many of their contemporaries, were also Arians, and they seem not actually to have converted to Catholicism in large numbers, at any rate, until the very end of the 7th century. The Lombards were a people of considerable gift in terms of law. Their legal culture was very high. But the popes opposed them, the Byzantines opposed them, and the popes in particular opposed Lombard attempts to unify the Italian peninsula. Quite regularly, or quite clearly, what the popes were concerned about is that if the Lombards were able to unify the Italian peninsula, then Rome would be either conquered or cut off. And in either case, the popes were not particularly happy with that situation. By the middle of the 8th century, the popes turned to the Franks to the far north, invited them to come into Italy, invited them to deal with the Lombard problem. Charlemagne answered that. Well, Charlemagne's father Pippin campaigned twice in Italy, attempted to put the Lombards back in their box, but the Lombards sort of rose again after Pippin's death. Pippin's son, Charlemagne, came to Italy in 773-774, defeated the last Lombard king, put him off his throne, and took the Lombard crown for himself, absent the Lombards. So the future was in a very real way left, by default, to the Anglo-Saxons and to the Franks. Now, when we mentioned very briefly the British Isles in our lectures on late antiquity, we said that the Romans had been pulling out of England between about 370 and about 410, pulling their troops out to deploy them elsewhere in the empire. Now, over a long period of time, it may reach back as far as 400, but probably from about 450 to about 600, considerable numbers of people whom we look back on and call the Anglo-Saxons began entering the British Isles. Some came as peaceful settlers, some came as soldiers, some came as mercenary soldiers. They came in a variety of different ways over a considerable period of time in groups of varying size. In other words, there was no Anglo-Saxon conquest of the British Isles. We really shouldn't think of it that way. These are peoples who basically came from the base of the Danish peninsula, Anglia, the narrow land, you see. They came from Saxony, northern Germany, but probably also some of them from further to the west, in other words, what we would think of perhaps as northern Holland to this day. So the Anglo-Saxons come in and gradually built a number of very small political entities. Much later English tradition remembers these as the kingdoms of the Heptarchy, of the 7 kingdoms. Well, it's a charming legend, and it's a useful way of thinking about early English history because it implies, of course, that there was considerable political division. There were lots of little entities. There was almost never a moment when there were 7 and only 7 kingdoms inside the British Isles. The number was often 10, a dozen, quite a number of small kingdoms. Some of these kingdoms, however, were notably more effective than others. Those that were effective tended to have 2 particular qualities. First, they were capably led. Second, they had room for expansion. Military expansion, of course, can be one important way of creating a kind of a social dynamic that can weld a political entity together by giving a kind of a common focus to the efforts, to the energies of the people who live in it. So, for instance, in the first place, Kent, the kingdom in the extreme southeast of England, and then Northumbria, the kingdom in the extreme north of England, and then Wessex, the kingdom in the southwest of England, and then Mercia, the kingdom in the middle of England. Sort of one after another, these various kingdoms would rise and would be perhaps the most prominent among the English kingdoms, but never, in the period we're talking about today, the only kingdom in England. Now, these kings learned some things. They learned some things probably from their Frankish neighbors. They learned some things from the Roman past, almost certainly here from books, and possibly from churchmen, certainly not from personal experience. For instance, the kings learned how to rule. They built impressive wooden halls and sat enthroned in these halls and ruled and made decisions and held courts of law and so on. Now, not the great magnificent stone basilicas of the Mediterranean world, but impressive wooden halls all the same. They used scepters, an abstract symbol of their power, an abstract symbol of their authority. They issued coins. They issued coins in their own name. One of the most important marks of rulership, of, well, sovereignty would be far too grand a word to use, but something like that, something like the notion of individual autonomous rule. They issued laws. They issued laws in their own name. What had the Romans taught the world? Well, to issue laws. To issue laws. They issued documents. They issued various kinds of documents. And their documents were hybrid. That is to say, they owed something to native traditions of drawing up documents and making agreements, but they also owed something to Roman forms of drawing up documents and making agreements. Now, some of the historical sources for early Anglo-Saxon England speak of Bretwaldas. Now, that word can mean broad wielders, somebody who wields authority broadly, or it can mean Britain wielders, somebody who wields authority in Britain. Scholars take the appearance of the term Bretwalda to imply that there was already a kind of a sense, an awareness of political unity long before it ever existed. Now, that's very important. When one looks at some of these early writings and sees the word Bretwalda attached to a particular king, it doesn't really mean he was ruling all of England. But it means that there was at least a vague sense that there was a certain kind of political hegemony exercised by some people over others. In the middle, well, actually in the last part of the 8th century, King Offa of Mercia, who reigned from 757 to 796, was the first king to call himself King of the English. Now that's interesting, it's revealing, it's tantalizing, it's tempting, and it's confusing. We don't really know what he meant by that. What did it mean in the 8th century for him to call himself the King of the English? Did it mean king of all the people who acknowledged him, king of the people who were called the English, king of the people who lived in Angleland, in the land of England? We don't really know for sure. But again, it implies the faint emergence of an idea of political unity, of political cohesion, long before such unity or cohesion actually exists. Now, these early Anglo-Saxon kings maintained very widespread commercial relations. We can see this from the fantastic ship burial that was put in the earth almost certainly in the late 6th, more like the early 7th century, and then unearthed in East Anglia in eastern England at Sutton Hoo in 1939. This ship burial contains treasures, items, materials, jewels, household implements, musical instruments, coins, spoons, bowls, a wide array of things from the Celtic world, from Scandinavia, from the Frankish world, from the Mediterranean, indeed from far off Byzantium, which suggests something to us about the very widespread and far-flung connections of the early Anglo-Saxons. So there is a potentially successful and effective political tradition emerging in the British Isles in the post-Roman period. More important in this early period, at any rate, are the Franks. Now, the Franks are another of these confederations of peoples. We talked in more detail about the Visigoths on an earlier day. We could go through some of the same kinds of discussions here. In other words, you know that not every Frank was a Frank. In other words, that it isn't clear that the Franks are a sort of a distinct biological group. It's a confederation of peoples whom the Romans first encountered living along the Rhine in the 250s AD. At least that's when the Frankish name first emerges for us in our sources. Rome made treaties with them. Rome fought wars with them. Rome dealt with them in a wide variety of ways over quite a long period of time. And slowly but surely, the Franks began to play a very important role in the history of Gaul. The Franks began moving from the Rhineland towards the south by slow agricultural expansion at first, moving across what we would call southern Holland, across what we would call Belgium, and on into the north of what we would call France. But it's important to say that this earliest Frankish expansion was not military, though occasionally it was attended by some violence. But fundamentally, it wasn't military. Fundamentally, it was just an agricultural expansion towards the south into very fertile territories. Now, the Franks began gradually, particularly after the absence of effective Roman control in Gaul, to expand against their neighbors. We've mentioned a couple of times already that in 507 they defeated the Visigoths, drove them eventually over the Pyrenees and into Spain. The Franks moved against the Burgundians, those people who had evoked in the time of Aetius a first coalition of Germanic peoples in Gaul fighting as Romani, fighting as Romans. Well, the Franks swallowed the Burgundians. The Franks also began expanding eastward across the Rhine, back into what we would think of today as Germany. Now, just as our early kingdoms that all vanished had strikes against them, the Franks, in a sense, had little credit in the bank. The Franks blended very early with the Gallo-Romans, the population of Gaul, especially through intermarriage. There were no racial or ethnic antipathies, and the Franks began to intermarry. Now, it's important to say, the Franks might have been 5% of the population of Gaul. So they were a conquering minority. They were a ruling minority. They were never a majority of the population. So intermarriage, of course, meant that there was the great likelihood that the Franks would vanish in a kind of a marital soup of other peoples. The Franks converted directly from paganism to Catholicism. At least that's the way the story was always remembered by the Franks. There does appear to have been a brief moment when at least some of the Franks' leaders flirted with Arianism, not least because some of the other key Germanic peoples around Western Europe, Theodoric, for instance, in Italy, were themselves Arians. But gradually, the Franks converted directly to Catholicism. So whereas Arianism was a strike against others, Catholicism was a plus for the Franks. From the late 5th century, the Frankish leaders began allying with leading churchmen, great abbots of monasteries and great bishops. This hooked them up with the late Roman intelligentsia, it hooked them up with the leading social classes, and of course it hooked them up with the leaders of the Catholic faith, which they themselves had embraced. So again, as there were strikes against some other people on those very grounds, the Franks managed to make capital out of their connections with the church. Now, the Franks maintained in lots of ways the traditional Roman order of things. Their official language was still Latin. They would have spoken Frankish, a Germanic dialect, but their official language was Latin. We see that, for example, things like wills continued to be kept and registered in Latin. We see that laws continued to be issued in Latin. As with the Anglo-Saxons, we see coins being issued in the names of the king. We see courts of law being held. In other words, all of the trappings of provincial life of the Roman world appear to persist. Perhaps on a lesser scale, but they're still there. Now, Clovis, who reigned from 486 until 511, was the greatest of the Merovingian kings. The Merovingians were the family of which Clovis was the greatest member. When he died in 511, he divided his kingdom among his sons. And usually after this, for the next couple of centuries, there was not a single Frankish kingdom, but usually three: Austrasia in the northeast, Neustria in the northwest, and Burgundy in the southeast. Now, frequent strife among the Merovingian rulers in each of these three sub-kingdoms, led to increasing dominance by powerful aristocratic families. Slowly but surely, those aristocratic families gathered to themselves more power, more influence, more wealth, more authority, more followers than even the royal family itself had. The greatest, the most powerful, the most successful of these aristocratic families is the one we know as Carolingian. And it was that family that produced Charlemagne. We will take up Charlemagne in our next lecture. But the point is that we have the Franks on a successful trajectory in the lands over which they ruled. Let's say just a very quick word about the rest of the British Isles. Ireland's political evolution was embryonic in this very early period. There were dozens of tiny little kingdoms on the island, no movement yet towards coherent political development. And the same is true of Scotland and of Wales in this period. We'll encounter these areas in later lectures when they began to achieve something like political cohesion. But in the period that we're concerned with, there really has not yet been any effective cohesion in these realms. The same is true of the Slavic lands of Eastern Europe, and the same is true of the Scandinavian realms to the north. In the period 500 to 750, roughly, it is the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon worlds that attract our attention. The second great development of this period is the elaboration of the Catholic Church across Western Europe, the Christianization of Europe. Now, in Rome, the popes slowly but surely turned away from the Mediterranean world and entered into relationships with the emerging political leaders of these Western realms that we've been talking about. After all, the people in the East were always bothering them on dogmatic grounds. They were always demanding taxes in Italy, for example, that would be spent fighting in the Balkans or indeed in Anatolia along the eastern frontier. The popes were not particularly keen on any of those things. And the popes began then to turn to the parties of Western Europe, a very important, a very fateful, a very significant step, rich with consequences for the future. The popes also continued to build their institutional leadership in central Italy. It is in these years, really from the late 7th across the early years of the 8th century, that the papal state, the ancestor of Vatican City, begins to come into being. And we find the odd situation of the leader of a church being simultaneously a head of state. Popes became very important patrons of art, patrons of learning in and around the city of Rome, building glorious buildings, attracting scholars to the city of Rome, playing, in other words, some of the roles that the Roman Church has played throughout its history. Elsewhere in Western Europe, and we've seen this point earlier, bishops remained very important local leaders. In each of these kingdoms, bishops became important leaders. Now, much was inherited from the Roman past. Indeed, many cities survived precisely because they had a bishop. Cities vanished if they didn't get a bishop. But in our period, 500 to 750 thereabouts, the most interesting thing is not the persistence of the old bishops' cities, but the growth of new bishops' cities. For example, in England, a whole host of cities emerged, but Canterbury in the south and York in the north as their leaders. In the Frankish world, it was the lands to the east of the Rhine that were significant. Those were areas that lay outside the Roman Empire and now were being folded into the system, as it were, by the work of missionaries, by the work of kings, and by the work of other churchmen. Bishops were beginning to come together in church councils to meet, to legislate for the church. It's very interesting to note that whole kingdoms worth of bishops gathered together to meet, to talk, to discuss, sometimes, to be sure, under the leadership and aegis of kings, sometimes on their own initiative. But however that may be, however the leadership question may play out, the church was coming together to rule, to organize, to legislate long before kings could actually do this. Long before there were unified kingdoms, there were unified churches within kingdoms. Bishops became key advisors to kings. Now this was rich with consequences. Sure, it brought the prestige, it brought the wealth, it brought the learning of the church to the advantage of kings. But it also meant that bishops, insofar as they had kings' ears, could talk to them, could advise them, could direct the way they would rule, to suggest to them that their royal office was not military, was not social, was not political, but was a kind of a divinely conferred ministerium, an office or responsibility that they held on behalf of God and in service to God's people. Monasteries also began to spread all over Europe. Now these monasteries played initially a variety of different and complementary roles. For example, monks played a very important role in converting the people of the countryside. Long before there was a fully articulated parish system, there were monasteries in the countryside. Now we think of monks as being people who ought to have been inside their monasteries, staying there, cloistered, as we say. But in fact, in the early Middle Ages, not so many monks were very cloistered much of the time. They were oftentimes out working, and one of the things that they did is function as missionaries. Many, indeed, of the missionaries who worked in the countryside of early medieval Europe were in fact Irish or Anglo-Saxon monks who traveled very far from home to preach and to teach. Monasteries were often very important centers of learning. Many of these monasteries developed great and important schools where books were copied, learning was preserved, traditions of learning were preserved. Now, it's very important to say that this learning was maintained for the benefit of the church. Monks did not think of themselves as preserving classical culture because people in the 21st century might want to read all the great Roman authors. They were reading these authors very much in line with Augustine from his book on Christian learning, which we talked about in an earlier lecture. They were spoiling the Egyptians. They collected the classics in order to learn their Latin well so that they could read the Bible, so that they could preach the Bible to people, so that they could save people's souls. That was, in a sense, the point of their educational enterprise. Now, what this manifests to us, however, is a new cultural life spreading itself across Europe. We think, for instance, of the exuberant decorative motifs that entered art with the Celts and with the Anglo-Saxons. A wonderful sense of color, a wonderful sense of abstraction, and of course all of those incredibly intricate, beautiful, interlacing, knotted designs that are still to this day the glories of much faux Celtic art. You can go and buy, imitations of Celtic art at virtually any store nowadays, but certainly many of these Celtic decorative motifs had a very long future in the history of Western art. Schools, generally located in monasteries, but sometimes in cathedrals, cathedral from the cathedra, the chair, the seat of a bishop, where the bishop articulates his authority. So schools sometimes in monasteries, sometimes in cathedrals. In other words, very much it was the case that learning was in the hands of the church. Now what was that learning based on? Fundamentally it was based on the Bible. And it was based on the church fathers as the great expositors, as the great interpreters, as the great teachers of the Bible. Now I want to repeat, because it's a very important point, and it's one that we're going to meet again and again in some future lectures, that the purpose of education in this period was not to bring pleasure. It wasn't to form sort of liberally educated persons. It was indeed designed to save souls. It wasn't to help you get a job. You didn't go to school in the early Middle Ages because then you wanted to go out and get a good job. You went to school, if you went to school at all, and mostly schooling was confined to members of the clergy or perhaps members of the high aristocracy. Schooling was for religious purposes. Now the greatest centers initially of education were in the north of England. Lindisfarne, for example, a monastery that lays just off the coast of the north of England, had very strong Irish connections. It produced a spectacular gospel book, which can be viewed in the British Library to this day, the British Museum, I should say. Library and Museum used to be in the same place. And it is a masterpiece of biblical scholarship and of book art. The north of England also produced remarkable scholars. The greatest single figure of all was the Anglo-Saxon Bede. Bede lived from 673 to 735. In a lifetime at Wearmouth and Jarrow, he lived there from the time he was 5 years old in the monasteries in the north of England. He wrote a magnificent history, which is still a masterpiece of historical writing and an important source for historians. He wrote biblical commentaries. He wrote theology. He wrote books on time reckoning. It is very largely to Bede that we owe the fact that we date today Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord. So by about 750, we see another region with a group of peoples professing a universal faith, placing that faith at the center of their historical experience, looking to one holy book, thinking of themselves as a new chosen people, and entertaining complex relationships with the classical tradition. We see also in an interesting way the gradual shift of power from the Mediterranean to the north. We see also, as we end our consideration of these heirs of the Roman Empire, a volatile situation in the Mediterranean. But we see, above all, the evolution of antiquity into three different, distinct, yet kindred heirs of Rome.